This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 6. Discovery. Mr. and Mrs. Shelby, after their protracted discussion of the night before, did not readily sink to repose, and in consequence slept somewhat later than usual the ensuing morning. "I wonder what keeps Eliza," said Mrs. Shelby, after giving her bell repeated pulls to no purpose. Mr. Shelby was standing before his dressing-glass, sharpening his razor, and just then the door opened, and a colored boy entered with his shaving-water. "Andy," said his mistress, "step to Eliza's door and tell her I have rung for her 3 times. Poor thing," she added to herself with a sigh. Andy soon returned, with eyes very wide in astonishment. "Lor, missus, Lizzie's drawers all open, and her things all lying every which way, and I believe she's done cleared out." The truth flashed upon Mr. Shelby and his wife at the same moment. He exclaimed, "Then she suspected it, and she's off." "The Lord be thanked," said Mrs. Shelby. "I trust she is." "Wife, you talk like a fool. Really, it will be something pretty awkward for me if she is. Haley saw that I hesitated about selling this child, and he'll think I connived at it to get him out of the way. It touches my honor," and Mr. Shelby left the room hastily. There was great running and ejaculating, and opening and shutting of doors, and appearance of faces in all shades of color in different places, for about a quarter of an hour. One person only, who might have shed some light on the matter, was entirely silent, and that was the head cook, Aunt Chloe. Silently, and with a heavy cloud settled down over her once joyous face, she proceeded making out her breakfast biscuits, as if she heard and saw nothing of the excitement around her. Very soon about a dozen young imps were roosting, like so many crows, on the veranda railings, each one determined to be the first one to apprise the strange master of his ill luck. "He'll be raal mad, I'll be bound," said Andy. "Won't he swar?" said little black Jake. "Yes, for he does swar," said woolly-headed Mandy, "and I hearn him yesterday at dinner. I hearn him all about it, 'cause I got it into the closet where Missus keeps the great jugs, and I hearn every word." And Mandy, who had never in her life thought of the meaning of a word she had heard more than a black cat, now took airs of superior wisdom, and strutted about forgetting to state that, though actually coiled up among the jugs at the time specified, she had been fast asleep all the time. When, at last, Haley appeared, hooted and spurred, he was saluted with the bad tidings on every hand. The young imps on the veranda were not disappointed in their hope of hearing him swar, which he did with a fluency and fervency which delighted them all amazingly, as they ducked and dodged hither and thither, to be out of the reach of his riding-whip, and all whooping off together they tumbled in a pile of immeasurable giggle on the withered turf under the veranda, where they kicked up their heels and shouted to their full satisfaction. "If I had the little devils," muttered Haley between his teeth. "But you hain't got them, though," said Andy, with a triumphant flourish, and making a string of indescribable mouths at the unfortunate trader's back, when he was fairly beyond hearing. "I say now, Shelby, this yer's a most extraordinary business," said Haley, as he abruptly entered the parlor. "It seems that gal's off with her young un." "Mr. Haley, Mrs. Shelby is present," said Mr. Shelby. "I beg pardon, ma'am," said Haley, bowing slightly, with a still lowering brow. "But still I say, as I said before, this yer's a singular report. Is it true, sir?" "Sir," said Mr. Shelby, "if you wish to communicate with me, you must observe something of the decorum of a gentleman. Andy, take Mr. Haley's hat and riding-whip. Take a seat, sir. Yes, sir, I regret to say that the young woman, excited by overhearing or having reported to her something of this business, has taken her child in the night and made off." "I did expect fair dealing in this matter, I confess," said Haley. "Well, sir," said Mr. Shelby, turning sharply round upon him, "what am I to understand by that remark? If any man calls my honor in question, I have but one answer for him." The trader cowered at this, and in a somewhat lower tone said that "it was plaguy hard on a fellow that had made a fair bargain to be gulled that way." "Mr. Haley," said Mr. Shelby, "if I did not think you had some cause for disappointment, I should not have borne from you the rude and unceremonious style of your entrance into my parlor this morning. I say thus much, however, since appearances call for it, that I shall allow of no insinuations cast upon me, as if I were at all partner to any unfairness in this matter. Moreover, I shall feel bound to give you every assistance in the use of horses, servants, etc., in the recovery of your property. So, in short, Haley," said he, suddenly dropping from the tone of dignified coolness to his ordinary one of easy frankness, "the best way for you is to keep good-natured and eat some breakfast, and we will then see what is to be done." Mrs. Shelby now rose, and said her engagements would prevent her being at the breakfast-table that morning, and deputing a very respectable mulatto woman to attend to the gentleman's coffee at the sideboard, she left the room. "Old lady don't like your humble servant, over and above," said Haley, with an uneasy effort to be very familiar. "I am not accustomed to hear my wife spoken of with such freedom," said Mr. Shelby dryly. "Beg pardon. Of course, only a joke, you know," said Haley, forcing a laugh. "Some jokes are less agreeable than others," rejoined Shelby. "Devilish free, now I've signed those papers, cuss him," muttered Haley to himself. "Quite grand since yesterday." Never did fall of any prime minister at court occasion wider surges of sensation than the report of Tom's fate among his compeers on the place. It was the topic in every mouth, everywhere, and nothing was done in the house or in the field but to discuss its probable results. Eliza's flight, an unprecedented event on the place, was also a great accessory in stimulating the general excitement. Black Sam, as he was commonly called, from his being about 3 shades blacker than any other son of ebony on the place, was revolving the matter profoundly in all its phases and bearings, with a comprehensiveness of vision and a strict lookout to his own personal well-being that would have done credit to any white patriot in Washington. "It's an ill wind that blow nowhere, that are fact," said Sam, sententiously, giving an additional hoist to his pantaloons, and adroitly substituting a long nail in place of a missing suspender button, with which effort of mechanical genius he seemed highly delighted. "Yes, it's an ill wind blows nowhar," he repeated. "Now dar Tom's down, wall, course there's room for some nigger to be up, and why not this nigger? That's the idea. Tom, riding round the country, boots blacked, pass in his pocket, all grand as Cuffy, but who he? Now, why shouldn't Sam? That's what I want to know." "Halloo, Sam! Oh, Sam! Masters wants you to coach Bill and Jerry," said Andy, cutting short Sam's soliloquy. "Hi! What's the foot now, young'un?" "Why, you don't know, I suppose, that Lizzie's cut stick and clared out with her young'un." "You teach your granny," said Sam, with infinite contempt. "Knowed it a heap sight sooner'n you did. This nigger ain't so green now." "Well, anyhow, Master wants Bill and Jerry geared right up, and you and I's to go with Massa Haley to look arter her." "Good now, that's the time o' day," said Sam. "It's Sam that's called for in these here times. He's the nigger. See if I don't cotch her now. Master'll see what Sam can do." "Ah, but Sam," said Andy, "you'd better think twice, for Missus don't want her cotched, and she'll be in your wool." "Hi!" said Sam, opening his eyes. "How you know that?" "Heard her say so, my own self, this blessed morning when I bring in Marster's shaving water. She sent me to see why Lizzie didn't come to dress her, and when I telled her she was off, she just raz up and says she, 'The Lord be praised!' and Master he seemed rail mad, and says he, 'Wife, you talk like a fool.' But Lord, she'll bring him to. I knows well enough how that'll be. It's allers best to stand Missus' side of the fence, now I tell you." Black Sam, upon this, scratched his woolly pate, which, if it did not contain very profound wisdom, still contained a great deal of a particular species much in demand among politicians of all complexions and countries, and vulgarly denominated knowing which side the bread is buttered. So, stopping with grave consideration, he again gave a hitch to his pantaloons, which was his regularly organized method of assisting his mental perplexities. "Der ain't no saying never, 'bout no kind of thing in dis yer world," he said, at last. Sam spoke like a philosopher, emphasizing this as if he had had a large experience in different sorts of worlds, and therefore had come to his conclusions advisedly. "Now, certain I'd 'a' said that Missus would 'a' scoured the varsal world after Lizzie," added Sam thoughtfully. "So she would," said Andy, "but can't you see through the ladder, you black nigger? Missus don't want this yer Massa Haley to get Lizzie's boy, that's to go." "Hi!" said Sam. with an indescribable intonation known only to those who have heard it among the negroes.
"I'll tell ye more'n all," said Andy. "I specs you'd better be making tracks for dem hosses, mighty sudden, too, for I hearn Missis 'quiring arter yer, so you've stood fooling long enough."
Sam, upon this, began to bestir himself in real earnest, and after a while appeared bearing down gloriously toward the house, with Bill and Jerry in full canter, and adroitly throwing himself off before they had had any idea of stopping, he brought them up alongside of the horse-post like a tornado. Haley's horse, which was a skittish young colt, winced and bounced and pulled hard at his halter.
"Ho, ho!" said Sam. "Skeery, are you?"
And his black visage lighted up with a curious mischievous gleam.
"I'll fix you now," said he.
There was a large beech tree overshadowing the place, and the small, sharp, triangular beech nuts lay scattered thickly on the ground. With one of these in his fingers, Sam approached the colt, stroked and patted, and seemed apparently busy in soothing his agitation. On pretense of adjusting the saddle, he adroitly slipped under the sharp little nut, in such a manner that the least weight brought upon the saddle would annoy the nervous sensibilities of the animal, without leaving any perceptible graze or wound.
"Dar," he said, rolling his eyes with an approving grin. "Me fix 'em."
At this moment Mrs. Shelby appeared on the balcony, beckoning to him. Sam approached with as good a determination to pay court as did ever suitor after a vacant place at St. James or Washington.
"Why have you been loitering so, Sam? I sent Andy to tell you to hurry."
"Lord bless you, missus," said Sam, "horses won't be cotched all in a minute. They done cleared out way down to the south pasture, and the Lord knows whar."
"Sam, how often must I tell you not to say 'Lord bless you' and 'the Lord knows' and such things? It's wicked."
"Oh, Lord bless my soul, I done forgot, missus. I won't say nothing of the sort no more."
"Why, Sam, you just have said it again."
"Did I? Oh, Lord, I didn't go for to say it."
"You must be careful, Sam."
"Just let me get my breath, missus, and I'll start fair. I'll be very careful."
"Well, Sam, you are to go with Mr. Haley, to show him the road and help him. Be careful of the horses, Sam. You know Jerry was a little lame last week. Don't ride them too fast."
Mrs. Shelby spoke the last words with a low voice and strong emphasis.
"Let this child alone for that,"
said Sam, rolling up his eye with a volume of meaning.
"Lord knows, hi, didn't I say dat?"
said he, suddenly catching his breath with a ludicrous flourish of apprehension which made his mistress laugh, spite herself.
"Yes, missus, I'll look out for the horses.
"Now, Andy," said Sam, returning to his stand under the beech trees,
"you see I wouldn't be tall surprised if that ar gentleman critter should give a fling by and by, when he comes to be getting up. You know, Andy, critters will do such things."
And therewith Sam poked Andy in the side in a highly suggestive manner.
"Hi," said
Andy, with an air of instant appreciation.
"Yes, you see, Andy, missus wants to make time. Dat ar's clear to der most ordinary observer. I just make a little for her. Now, you see, get all dese der horses loose, carperin' permiscus round dis yere lot and down to the wood dar, and I spec Masser'll won't be off in a hurry."
Andy grinned.
"You see," said Sam, "you see, Andy, if any such thing should happen as that Masser Haley's horse should begin to act contrary and cut up, you and I just let's go arn to help him, and we'll help him, oh yes."
And Sam and Andy laid their heads back on their shoulders and broke into a low, immoderate laugh, snapping their fingers and flourishing their heels with exquisite delight. At this instant Haley appeared on the veranda, somewhat mollified by certain cups of very good coffee. He came out smiling and talking in tolerably restored humor. Sam and Andy, clawing for certain fragmentary palm leaves which they were in the habit of considering as hats, flew to the horse-posts to be ready to help Masser. Sam's palm leaf had been ingeniously disentangled from all pretensions to braid as respects its brim, and the slivers, starting apart and standing upright, gave it a blazing air of freedom and defiance quite equal to that of any Fiji chief. While the whole brim of Andy's being departed bodily, he rapped the crown on his head with a dexterous thump, and looked about well pleased, as if to say, "Who says I haven't got a hat?"
"Well, boys," said Haley, "look alive now. We must lose no time. Not a bit of him, Masser,"
said Sam, putting Haley's rein in his hand and holding his stirrup while Andy was untying the other two horses. The instant Haley touched the saddle, the mettlesome creature bounded from the earth with a sudden spring that threw his master sprawling some feet off on the soft, dry turf. Sam, with frantic ejaculations, made a dive at the reins, but only succeeded in brushing the blazing palm leaf aforenamed into the horse's eyes, which by no means tended to allay the confusion of his nerves. So, with great vehemence, he overturned Sam, and giving 2 or 3 contemptuous snorts, flourished his heels vigorously in the air, and was soon prancing away towards the lower end of the lawn, followed by Bill and Jerry, whom Andy had not failed to let loose according to contract, speeding them off with various direful ejaculations. And now ensued a miscellaneous scene of confusion. Sam and Andy ran and shouted, dogs barked here and there, and Mike, Mose, Mandy, Fanny, and all the smaller specimens on the place, both male and female, raced, clapped hands, whooped, and shouted with outrageous officiousness and untiring zeal. Haley's horse, which was a white one, and very fleet and spirited, appeared to enter into the spirit of the scene with great gusto, and having for his coursing ground a lawn of nearly half a mile in extent, gently sloping down on every side into indefinite woodland, he appeared to take infinite delight in seeing how near he could allow his pursuers to approach him, and then, when within a hand's breadth, whisk off with a start and a snort, like a mischievous beast as he was, and career far down into some alley of the woodlot. Nothing was further from Sam's mind than to have any one of the troop taken until such season as should seem to him most befitting, and the exertions that he made were certainly most heroic, like the sword of Coeur de Lion, which always blazed in the front and thickest of the battle. Sam's palm leaf was to be seen everywhere when there was the least danger that a horse could be caught. There he would bear down full tilt, shouting, "Now for it! Cotch him! Cotch him!" in a way that would set everything to indiscriminate rout in a moment. Haley ran up and down, and cursed and swore and stamped miscellaneously. Mr. Shelby in vain tried to shout directions from the balcony, and Mrs. Shelby from her chamber window alternately laughed and wondered, not without some inkling of what lay at the bottom of all this confusion. At last, about 12 o'clock, Sam appeared triumphant, mounted on Jerry, with Haley's horse by his side, reeking with sweat, but with flashing eyes and dilated nostrils, showing that the spirit of freedom had not yet entirely subsided. "He's cotched!" he exclaimed triumphantly. "If it hadn't been for me, they might have bust themselves all on 'em, but I cotched 'em." "You," growled Haley in no amiable mood, "if it hadn't been for you, this never would have happened." "Lord bless us, massa," said Sam, in a tone of the deepest concern, "and me that has been racing and chasing till the sweat just pours off me." "Well, well," said Haley, "you've lost me near 3 hours with your cursed nonsense. Now let's be off, and have no more fooling." "Why, massa," said Sam, in a deprecating tone, "I believe you mean to kill us all clar, horses and all. Here we are all just ready to drop down, and the critters all in a reek of sweat. Why, massa won't think of starting on now till arter dinner. Massa hoss wants rubbing down. See how he splashed himself? And Jerry limps, too. Don't think missus would be willing to have us start this yar way, nohow. Lord bless you, massa, we can catch up if we do stop. Lizzie never was no great of a walker." Mrs. Shelby, who, greatly to her amusement, had overheard this conversation from the veranda, now resolved to do her part. She came forward, and, courteously expressing her concern for Haley's accident, pressed him to stay to dinner, saying that the cook should bring it on the table immediately. Thus, all things considered, Haley, with rather an equivocal grace, proceeded to the parlor, while Sam, rolling his eyes after him with unutterable meaning, proceeded gravely with the horses to the stable-yard. "Did yer see him, Andy? Did yer see him?" said Sam, when he had got fairly beyond the shelter of the barn and fastened the horse to a post. "Oh, Lord, if it wasn't as good as a meeting now, to see him a-dancing and kicking and swaring at us. Didn't I hear him? 'Swar away, old fellow,' says I to myself. 'Will yer have your hoss now, or wait till you cotch him?' says I. Lor, Andy, I think I can see him now." And Sam and Andy leaned up against the barn and laughed to their hearts' content. "Yer oughter seen how mad he looked when I brought his hoss up. Lord, he'd killed me if he durst to. And there I was, a-standing as innercent and as humble." "Lor, I seed you," said Andy. "Ain't you an old hoss, Sam?" "Rather specks I am," said Sam. "Did you see missus upstairs at the winder?" "I seed her laughing." "I'm sure I was racing so I didn't see nothing," said Andy.
"Well, you see," said Sam, proceeding gravely to wash down Haley's pony, "I's 'quired what yer may call a habit of bobservation, Andy. It's a very 'important habit, Andy, and I commend yer to be cultivating it now you're young. Hist up that hind foot, Andy. You see, Andy, it's bobservation makes all difference in niggers. Didn't I see which way the wind blew this yer morning? Didn't I see what Miss wanted, though she never let on? That ar's bobservation, Andy. I specs it's what you may call a faculty. Faculties is different in different peoples, but cultivation on 'em goes a great way."
"I guess if I hadn't helped your bobservation this morning, you wouldn't have seen your way so smart," said Andy.
"Andy," said Sam, "you's a promisin' child, there hain't no matter of doubt. I thinks lots of yer, Andy, and I don't feel no ways ashamed to take idees from you. We oughtn't to overlook nobody, Andy, 'cause the smart of us gets tripped up sometimes. And so, Andy, let's go up to the house now. I'll be bound Miss'll keep us an uncommon good bite this year time."
End of chapter 6. Vox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 7. The Mother's Struggle. It is impossible to conceive of a human creature more wholly desolate and forlorn than Eliza when she turned her footsteps from Uncle Tom's cabin. Her husband's suffering and dangers, and the danger of her child, all blended in her mind, with a confused and stunning sense of the risk she was running in leaving the only home she had ever known and cutting loose from the protection of a friend whom she loved and revered. Then there was the parting from every familiar object, the place where she had grown up, the trees under which she had played, the groves where she had walked many an evening in happier days by the side of her young husband. Everything, as it lay in the clear, frosty starlight, seemed to speak reproachfully to her, and ask her whither could she go from a home like that. But stronger than all was maternal love, wrought into a paroxysm of frenzy by the near approach of a fearful danger. Her boy was old enough to have walked by her side, and in an indifferent case she would only have led him by the hand, but now the bare thought of putting him out of her arms made her shudder, and she strained him to her bosom with a convulsive grasp as she went rapidly forward. The frosty ground creaked beneath her feet, and she trembled at the sound. Every quaking leaf and fluttering shadow sent the blood backward to her heart and quickened her footsteps. She wondered within herself at the strength that seemed to be come upon her, for she felt the weight of her boy as if it had been a feather, and every flutter of fear seemed to increase the supernatural power that bore her on, while from her pale lips burst forth, in frequent ejaculations, the prayer to a friend above, "Lord, help! Lord, save me!" If it were your Harry, mother, or your Willie, that were going to be torn from you by a brutal trader tomorrow morning, if you had seen the man and heard that the papers were signed and delivered, and you had only from 12 o'clock till morning to make good your escape, how fast could you walk? How many miles could you make in those few brief hours, with the darling at your bosom, the little sleepy head on your shoulder, the small soft arms trustingly holding on to your neck? For the child slept. At first the novelty and alarm kept him waking, but his mother so hurriedly repressed every breath or sound, and so assured him that if he were only still she would certainly save him, that he clung quietly round her neck, only asking, as he found himself sinking to sleep,
"Mother, I don't need to keep awake, do I?" "No, my darling, sleep if you want to." "But, Mother, if I do get asleep, you won't let him get me?"
"No, so may God help me," said his mother, with a paler cheek and a brighter light in her large dark eyes.
"You're sure, ain't you, Mother?"
"Yes, sure," said the mother, in a voice that startled herself, for it seemed to her to come from a spirit within that was no part of her. And the boy dropped his little weary head on her shoulder and was soon asleep. How the touch of those warm arms, the gentle breathings that came in her neck, seemed to add fire and spirit to her movements. It seemed to her as if strength poured into her in electric streams from every gentle touch and movement of the sleeping, confiding child. Sublime is the dominion of the mind over the body, that for a time can make flesh and nerve impregnable, and string the sinews like steel, so that the weak become so mighty. The boundaries of the farm, the grove, the woodlot, passed by her dizzily as she walked on. And still she went, leaving one familiar object after another, slacking not, pausing not, till reddening daylight found her many a long mile from all traces of any familiar objects upon the open highway. She had often been with her mistress to visit some connections in the little village of T, not far from the Ohio River, and knew the road well. To go thither, to escape across the Ohio River, were the first hurried outlines of her plan of escape. Beyond that she could only hope in God. When horses and vehicles began to move along the highway with that alert perception peculiar to a state of excitement, and which seems to be a sort of inspiration, she became aware that her headlong pace and distracted air might bring on her remark and suspicion. She therefore put the boy on the ground, and, adjusting her dress and bonnet, she walked on at as rapid a pace as she thought consistent with the preservation of appearances. In her little bundle she had provided a store of cakes and apples, which she used as expedients for quickening the speed of the child, rolling the apples some yards before them, when the boy would run with all his might after it; and this ruse, often repeated, carried them over many a half-mile. After a while they came to a thick patch of woodland, through which murmured a clear brook. As the child complained of hunger and thirst, she climbed over the fence with him, and sitting down behind a large rock which concealed them from the road, she gave him a breakfast out of her little package. The boy wondered and grieved that she could not eat, and when, putting his arms round her neck, he tried to wedge some of his cake into her mouth, it seemed to her that the rising in her throat would choke her.
"No, no, Harry, darling, mother can't eat till you are safe. We must go on, till we come to the river."
And she hurried again into the road, and again constrained herself to walk regularly and composedly forward. She was many miles past any neighborhood where she was personally known. If she should chance to meet any who knew her, she reflected that the well-known kindness of the family would be of itself a blind to suspicion, as making it an unlikely supposition that she could be a fugitive. As she was also so white as not to be known as of colored lineage without a critical survey, and her child was white also, it was much easier for her to pass on unsuspected. On this presumption she stopped at noon at a neat farmhouse to rest herself and buy some dinner for her child and self. For as the danger decreased with the distance, the supernatural tension of the nervous system lessened, and she found herself both weary and hungry. The good woman, kindly and gossiping, seemed rather pleased than otherwise with having somebody come in to talk with, and accepted, without examination, Eliza's statement that she was going on a little piece to spend a week with her friends, all which she hoped in her heart might prove strictly true. An hour before sunset she entered the village of T, by the Ohio River, weary and footsore, but still strong in heart. Her first glance was at the river, which lay, like Jordan, between her and the Canaan of liberty on the other side. It was now early spring, and the river was swollen and turbulent. Great cakes of floating ice were swinging heavily to and fro in the turbid waters. Owing to the peculiar form of the shore on the Kentucky side, the land bending far out into the water, the ice had been lodged and detained in great quantities, and the narrow channel which swept round the bend was full of ice, piled one cake over another, thus forming a temporary barrier to the descending ice, which lodged and formed a great undulating raft, filling up the whole river and extending almost to the Kentucky shore. Eliza stood for a moment contemplating this unfavorable aspect of things, which she saw at once must prevent the usual ferry-boat from running, and then turned into a small public house on the bank to make a few inquiries. The hostess, who was busy in various fizzing and stewing operations over the fire, preparatory to an evening meal, stopped, with a fork in her hand, as Eliza's sweet and plaintive voice arrested her.
"What is it?" she said. "Isn't there any ferry or boat that takes people over to B now?" she said.
"No, indeed," said the woman. "The boats has stopped running." Eliza's look of dismay and disappointment struck the woman, and she said, inquiringly, "May be you're wanting to get over? Anybody sick? You seem mighty anxious."
"I've got a child that's very dangerous," said Eliza. "I never heard of it till last night, and I've walked quite a piece to-day, in hopes to get to the ferry."
"Well, now, that's unlucky," said the woman, whose motherly sympathies were much aroused. "I'm really consarned for you. Solomon!" she called from the window towards a small back building. A man in leather apron and very dirty hands appeared at the door. "I say, Sol," said the woman, "is that our man going to tote them barrels over tonight?" "He said he should try, if 'twas any way prudent," said the man.
"There's a man apiece down here that's going over with some truck this evening, if he dars to. He'll be in here to supper tonight, so you'd better set down and wait. That's a sweet little fellow," added the woman, offering him a cake. But the child, wholly exhausted, cried with weariness. "Poor fellow, he isn't used to walking, and I've hurried him on so," said Eliza.
"Well, take him into this room," said the woman, opening into a small bedroom where stood a comfortable bed. Eliza laid the weary boy upon it, and laid his hands in hers till he was fast asleep. For her there was no rest. As a fire in her bones, the thought of the pursuer urged her on, and she gazed with longing eyes on the sullen, surging waters that lay between her and liberty. Here we must take our leave of her for the present, to follow the course of her pursuers. Though Mrs. Shelby had promised that the dinner should be hurried on table, yet it was soon seen, as the thing has often been seen before, that it required more than one to make a bargain. So, although the order was fairly given out in Haley's hearing, and carried to Aunt Chloe by at least half a dozen juvenile messengers, that dignitary only gave certain very gruff snorts and tosses of her head, and went on with every operation in an unusually leisurely and circumstantial manner. For some singular reason, an impression seemed to reign among the servants generally that Mrs. would not be particularly disobliged by delay, and it was wonderful what a number of counter-accidents occurred constantly to retard the course of things. One luckless wight contrived to upset the gravy, and then gravy had to be got up de novo, with due care and formality. Aunt Chloe, watching and stirring with dogged precision, answering shortly to all suggestions of haste that she "warn't a-going to have a raw gravy on the table to help nobody's catchings." One tumbled down with the water, and had to go to the spring for more, and another precipitated the butter into the path of events, and there was from time to time giggling news brought into the kitchen that
"Massa Haley was mighty oneasy, and that he couldn't sit in his cheer no ways, but was a-talking and stalking to the winders and through the porch."
"Saves him right," said Aunt Chloe, indignantly. "He'll get was nor oneasy one of these days, if he don't mend his ways. His master'll be sending for him, and then see how he'll look."
"He'll go to torment, and no mistake," said little Jake.
"He desarves it," said Aunt Chloe, grimly. "He's broke a many, many, many hearts, I tell you all," she said, stopping, with a fork uplifted in her hands. "It's like what Massa George reads in Revelations, souls a-calling under the altar, and a-calling on the Lord for vengeance on sich, and by and by the Lord he'll hear 'em, so he will."
Aunt Chloe, who was much revered in the kitchen, was listened to with open mouth, and the dinner being now fairly sent in, the whole kitchen was at leisure to gossip with her, and to listen to her remarks.
"Sich'll be burnt up forever, and no mistake, won't there?" said Andy. "I'd be glad to see it, I'll be bound," said little Jake.
"Chillun," said a voice that made them all start. It was Uncle Tom, who had come in and stood listening to the conversation at the door.
"Chillun," he said, "I'm afeard you don't know what you're saying. Forever is a dreadful word, chillun. It's awful to think on't. You oughtn't to wish that to any human critter."
"We wouldn't to anybody but the soul drivers," said Andy. "Nobody can help wishing it to them, they so awfully wicked."
"Don't nature herself kinder cry out on 'em?" said Aunt Chloe. "Don't they tear der sucking baby right off of his mother's breast and sell him and der little children as is crying and holding on by her clothes? Don't they pull 'em off and sells 'em? Don't they tear wife and husband apart," said Aunt Chloe, beginning to cry, "when it's just taken the very life on 'em? And all the while does they feel one bit, don't they drink and smoke and take it uncommon easy? Lord, if the devil don't get them, what's he good for?" And Aunt Chloe covered her face with her checkered apron and began to sob in good earnest. "Pray for them that spitefully use you, the good book says," says Tom.
"Pray for 'em," said Aunt Chloe. "Lord, it's tough. I can't pray for 'em."
"It's nature, Chloe, and nature's strong," said Tom, "but the Lord's grace is stronger. Besides, you ought to think what an awful state a poor critter's soul's in that'll do them are things. You ought to thank God that you ain't like him, Chloe. I'm sure I'd rather be sold 10,000 times over than to have all that our poor critter's got to answer for."
"So I'd a heap," said Jake. "Lord, shouldn't we cotch it, Andy?"
Andy shrugged his shoulders and gave an acquiescent whistle. "I'm glad Massa didn't go off this morning as he looked to," said Tom. "That ar hurt me more than selling it did. Maybe it might have been natural for him, but it would have come despot hard on me, as has known him for my baby. But I've seen Massa, and I begin to feel sort of reconciled to the Lord's will now. Massa couldn't help hisself. He did right, but I'm afeard things will be kind of going to rack when I'm gone. Massa can't be expected to be prying round everywhere as I've done, and keeping up all the ends. The boys all means well, but they's powerful careless. That ar troubles me." The bell here rang, and Tom was summoned to the parlor. "Tom," said his master kindly, "I want you to notice that I give this gentleman bonds to forfeit $1,000 if you are not on the spot when he wants you. He's going today to look after his other business, and you can have the day to yourself. Go anywhere you like, boy."
"Thank you, massa," said Tom.
"And mind yourself," said the trader, "and don't come it over your master with any of your nigger tricks, for I'll take every cent out of him if you ain't thar. If he'd hear to me, he wouldn't trust any on you, slippery as eels."
"Massa," said Tom, and he stood very straight, "I was just 6 years old when old missus put you into my arms, and you wasn't a year old. 'Thar,' says she, 'Tom, that's to be your young massa. Take good care of him,' says she. And now I just ask you, massa, have I ever broke word to you or gone contrary to you, specially since I was a Christian?"
Mr. Shelby was fairly overcome, and the tears rose to his eyes. "My good boy," said he, "the Lord knows you say but the truth, and if I was able to help it, all the world shouldn't buy you."
"And sure as I am a Christian woman," said Mrs. Shelby, "you shall be redeemed as soon as I can bring together means. Sir," she said to Haley, "take good account of who you sell him to, and let me know."
"Lor, yes, for that matter," said the trader. "I may bring him up in a year, not much the worse for wear, and trade him back."
"I'll trade with you, then, and make it for your advantage," said Mrs. Shelby.
"Of course," said the trader. "All's equal with me. Lives trade 'em up as down, so I does a good business. All I want is a living, you know, ma'am. That's all any of us wants, I suppose." Mr. and Mrs. Shelby both felt annoyed and degraded by the familiar impudence of the trader, and yet both saw the absolute necessity of putting a constraint on their feelings. The more hopelessly sordid and insensible he appeared, the greater became Mrs. Shelby's dread of his succeeding in recapturing Eliza and her child, and of course the greater her motive for detaining him by every female artifice. She therefore graciously smiled, assented, chatted familiarly, and did all she could to make time pass imperceptibly. At 2 o'clock Sam and Andy brought the horses up to the posts, apparently greatly refreshed and invigorated by the scamper of the morning. Sam was there, new oiled from dinner, with an abundance of zealous and ready officiousness. As Haley approached, he was boasting in flourishing style to Andy of the evident and eminent success of the operation, now that he had "fairly come to it."
"Your master, I suppose, don't keep no dogs," said Haley thoughtfully, as he prepared to mount. "Heaps of 'em," said Sam triumphantly. "There's Bruno, he's a roarer, and, besides that, about every nigger of us keeps a pup of some nature or other."
"Poh," said Haley, and he said something else, too, with regard to the said dogs, at which Sam muttered,
"I don't see no use cussin' on 'em no way."
"But your master don't keep no dogs. I pretty much know he don't, for tracking out niggers." Sam knew exactly what he meant, but he kept on a look of earnest and desperate simplicity.
"Our dogs all smells round considerable sharp. I s'pect they's the kind, though, they ain't never had no practice. They's fire dogs, though, at most anything, if you'd get 'em started. Here, Bruno," he called, whistling to the lumbering Newfoundland, who came pitching tumultuously towards them.
"You go hang," said Haley, getting up. "Come, tumble up now."
Sam tumbled up accordingly, dexterously contriving to tickle Andy as he did so, which occasioned Andy to split out into a laugh, greatly to Haley's indignation, who made a cut at him with his riding-whip.
"I'm 'stonished at yer, Andy," said Sam, with awful gravity. "This yer's serious business, Andy. Yer mustn't be a-making game. This yer ain't no way to help Massa."
"I shall take the straight road to the river," said Haley, decidedly, after they had come to the boundaries of the estate. "I know the way of all of them. They make tracks for the underground."
"Sartain," said Sam. "That's the idea. Massa Haley hits the thing right in the middle. Now there's two roads to the river, the dirt road and der pike. Which Massa mean to take?"
Andy looked up innocently at Sam, surprised at hearing this new geographical fact, but instantly confirmed what he said by a vehement reiteration.
"'Cause," said Sam, "I'd rather be 'clined to imagine that Lizzie'd take the dirt road, being it's least traveled."
Haley, notwithstanding that he was a very old bird, and naturally inclined to be suspicious of chaff, was rather brought up by this view of the case.
"If yer warn't both on yer such cussed liars now," he said, contemplatively, as he pondered a moment.
The pensive, reflective tone in which this was spoken appeared to amuse Andy prodigiously, and he drew a little behind, and shook so as apparently to run a great risk of falling off his horse, while Sam's face was immovably composed into the most doleful gravity.
"'Course," said Sam, "Massa can do as he'd ruther go de straight road if Massa thinks best. It's all one to us. Now, when I study 'pon it, I think the straight road de best, deridedly."
"She would naturally go a lonesome way,"
said Haley, thinking aloud, and not minding Sam's remark.
"There ain't no sayin'," said Sam. "Gals is peculiar. They never do nothing you thinks they will. More generally the contrary. Gals is naturally made contrary, and so, if you think they's gone one road, it is sartin you'd better go t'other, and then you'll be sure to find 'em. Now, my private 'pinion is Lizzie took der road, so I think we'd better take the straight one."
This profound generic view of the female sex did not seem to dispose Haley particularly to the straight road, and he announced decidedly that he should go the other, and asked Sam when they should come to it.
"A little piece ahead," said Sam,
giving a wink to Andy with the eye which was on Andy's side of the head, and he added gravely,
"But I've studied on the matter, and I'm quite clar we ought not to go that dar way. I never been over it no way. It's despite lonesome, and we might lose our way. Whar we'd come to, the Lord only knows."
"Nevertheless," said Haley, "I shall go that way."
"Now that I think on it, I think I hearn 'em tell that our road was all fenced up and down by der creek, and thar, ain't it, Andy?"
Andy wasn't certain. He'd only hearn tell about that road, but never been over it. In short, he was strictly noncommittal. Haley, accustomed to strike the balance of probabilities between lies of greater or lesser magnitude, thought that it lay in favor of the dirt road aforesaid. The mention of the thing he thought he perceived was involuntarily on Sam's part at first, and his confused attempts to dissuade him he set down to a desperate lying on second thoughts, as being unwilling to implicate Liza. When, therefore, Sam indicated the road, Haley plunged briskly into it, followed by Sam and Andy. Now, the road, in fact, was an old one that had formerly been a thoroughfare to the river, but abandoned for many years after the laying of the new pike. It was open for about an hour's ride, and after that it was cut across by various farms and fences. Sam knew this fact perfectly well. Indeed, the road had been so long closed up that Andy had never heard of it. He therefore rode along with an air of dutiful submission, only groaning and vociferating occasionally that 'twas desperate rough and bad for Jerry's foot. "Now, I just give yer warning," said Haley. "I know yer won't get me to turn off this road, with all yer fussing, so you shut up." "Massa will go on his way," said Sam with rueful submission, at the same time winking most portentously to Andy, whose delight was now very near the explosive point. Sam was in wonderful spirits, professed to keep a very brisk lookout, at one time exclaiming that he saw a gal's bonnet on the top of some distant eminence, or calling to Andy,
"If that thar wasn't Lizzie down the hollow,"
always making these exclamations in some rough or craggy part of the road, where the sudden quickening of speed was a special inconvenience to all parties concerned, and thus keeping Haley in a state of constant commotion. After riding about an hour in this way, the whole party made a precipitate and tumultuous descent into a barnyard belonging to a large farming establishment. Not a soul was in sight, all the hands being employed in the fields, But as the barn stood conspicuously and plainly square across the road, it was evident that their journey in that direction had reached a decided finale.
"Want that are what I tell you, master?" said Sam, with an air of injured innocence. "How does strange gentlemen 'spect to know more about a country than the natives born and raised?"
"You rascal," said Haley, "you knew all about this."
"Didn't I tell you I knowed, and you wouldn't believe me? I telled master 'twas all shet up and fenced up, and I didn't 'spect we could get through. Andy heard me."
It was all too true to be disputed, and the unlucky man had to pocket his wrath with the best grace he was able, and all three faced to the right about, and took up their line of march for the highway. In consequence of all the various delays, it was about 3/4 of an hour after Eliza had laid her child to sleep in the village tavern that the party came riding into the same place. Eliza was standing by the window looking out in another direction when Sam's quick eye caught a glimpse of her. Haley and Andy were 2 yards behind. At this crisis Sam contrived to have his hat blown off, and uttered a loud and characteristic ejaculation, which startled her at once. She drew suddenly back, the whole train swept by the window, round to the front door. 1,000 lives seemed to be concentrated in that one moment to Eliza. Her room opened by a side door to the river. She caught her child, sprang down the steps towards it. The trader caught a full glimpse of her just as she was disappearing down the bank, and throwing himself from his horse and calling loudly on Sam and Andy, he was after her like a hound after a deer. In that dizzy moment her feet to her scarce seemed to touch the ground, and a moment brought her to the water's edge. Right on behind they came, and nerved with strength such as God gives only to the desperate, with one wild cry and flying leap she vaulted sheer over the turbid current by the shore, on to the raft of ice beyond. It was a desperate leap, impossible to anything but madness and despair, and Haley, Sam, and Andy instinctively cried out and lifted up their hands as she did it. The huge green fragment of ice on which she alighted pitched and creaked as her weight came on it, but she stayed there not a moment. With wild cries and desperate energy she leapt to another and still another cake, stumbling, leaping, slipping, springing upwards again. Her shoes are gone, her stockings cut from her feet, while blood marked every step, but she saw nothing, felt nothing, till dimly, as in a dream, she saw the Ohio side, and a man helping her up the bank.
"You're a brave gal, now, whoever you are," said the man with an oath.
Eliza recognized the voice and face for a man who owned a farm not far from her old home.
"Oh, Mr. Symes, save me, do save me, do hide me," said Eliza.
"Why, what's this?" said the man. "Why, if 'tain't Shelby's gal."
"My child, this boy. He'd sold him. There is his massa," said she, pointing to the Kentucky shore. "Oh, Mr. Symes, you've got a little boy."
"So I have," said the man, as he roughly but kindly drew her up the steep bank.
"Besides, you're a right brave gal. I like grit wherever I see it."
When they had gained the top of the bank, the man paused.
"I'd be glad to do something for you," said he, "but then there's nowhere I could take you. The best I can do is to tell you to go thar," said he, pointing to a large white house which stood by itself, off the main street of the village. "Go thar. They're kind folks. There's no kind of danger but they'll help you. They're up to all of that sort of thing."
"The Lord bless you," said Eliza, earnestly.
No occasion in the world," said the man. "What I've done's of no account."
"Oh, surely, sir, you won't tell anyone?"
"Go to thunder, gal. What do you take a feller for?" "In course not," said the man. "Come now, go along like a likely sensible gal as you are. You've earned your liberty, and you shall have it for all of me."
The woman folded her child to her bosom and walked firmly and swiftly away. The man stood and looked after her.
"Shelby, now, maybe won't think this yard the most neighborly thing in the world, but what's a feller to do? If he catches one of my gals in the same fix, he's welcome to pay back. Somehow I never could see no kind of critter a striving and panting and trying to clear themselves with the dogs after 'em and go agin 'em. Besides, I don't see no kind of occasion for me to be hunter and catcher for other folks, either."
So spoke this poor, heathenish Kentuckian, who had not been instructed in his constitutional relations, and consequently was betrayed into acting in a sort of Christianized manner, which, if he had been better situated and more enlightened, he would not have been left to do. Haley had stood a perfectly amazed spectator of the scene till Eliza had disappeared up the bank, when he turned a blank, inquiring look on Sam and Andy.
"That are was a tolerable fair stroke of business," said Sam. "The gal's got 7 devils in her, I believe," said Haley. "How like a wildcat she jumped!"
"Wal now," said Sam, scratching his head, "I hope Marster'll 'scuse us tryin' dat our road. Don't think I feel spry enough for dat ar, no way." And Sam gave a hoarse chuckle.
"You laugh," said the trader, with a growl.
"Lord bless you, Marster, I couldn't help it now," said Sam, giving way to the long pent-up delight of his soul. "She looked so keerus, a leapin' and springin', ice a crackin' only to hear her plump, her ker chunk, ker splash, spring. Lord, how she goes it!" And Sam and Andy laughed till the tears rolled down their cheeks.
"I'll make you laugh t'other side of your mouths," said the trader, laying about their heads with his riding whip.
Both ducked and ran shouting up the bank, and were on their horses before he was up.
"Good evening, Massa,"
said Sam with much gravity.
"I very much 'spect Missus be anxious about Jerry. Massa Haley won't want us no longer. Missus wouldn't hear of our riding the critters over Lizzie's bridge tonight."
And with a facetious poke into Andy's ribs, he started off, followed by the latter, at full speed, their shouts of laughter coming faintly on the wind. End of chapter 7. Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Chapter 8. Eliza's Escape. Eliza made her desperate retreat across the river just in the dusk of twilight. The gray mist of evening, rising slowly from the river, enveloped her as she disappeared up the bank, and the swollen current and floundering masses of ice presented a hopeless barrier between her and her pursuer. Haley therefore slowly and discontentedly returned to the little tavern, to ponder further what was to be done. The woman opened to him the door of a little parlor, covered with a rag carpet, where stood a table with a very shining black oilcloth, sundry lank, high-backed wood chairs, with some plaster images in resplendent colors on the mantel-shelf, above a very dimly smoking grate. A long hardwood settle extended its uneasy length by the chimney, and here Haley sat him down to meditate on the instability of human hopes and happiness in general.
"What did I want with a little cuss, now?" he said to himself, "that I should have got myself treat like a coon as I am, this here way?"
And Haley relieved himself by repeating over a not very select litany of imprecations on himself, which, though there was the best possible reason to consider them as true, we shall, as a matter of taste, omit. He was startled by the loud and dissonant voice of a man who was apparently dismounting at the door. He hurried to the window.
"By the land, if this here ain't the nearest now to what I've heard folks call Providence," said Haley. "I do believe that thar's Tom Locker."
Haley hastened out. Standing by the bar in the corner of the room was a brawny, muscular man, full 6 feet in height and broad in proportion. He was dressed in a coat of buffalo skin, made with the hair outward, which gave him a shaggy and fierce appearance, perfectly in keeping with the whole air of his physiognomy. In the head and face every organ and lineament expressive of brutal and unhesitating violence was in a state of the highest possible development. Indeed, could our readers fancy a bulldog come onto a man's estate and walking about in a hat and coat, they would have no unapt idea of the general style and effect of his physique. He was accompanied by a traveling companion, in many respects an exact contrast to himself. He was short and slender, lithe and cat-like in his motions, and had a peering, mousing expression about his keen black eyes, with which every feature of his face seemed sharpened into sympathy. His thin, long nose ran out as if it was eager to bore into the nature of things in general. His sleek, thin, black hair was stuck eagerly forward, and all his motions and evolutions expressed a dry, cautious acuteness. The great man poured out a big tumbler half full of raw spirits and gulped it down without a word. The little man stood tiptoe, and putting his head first to one side and then the other, and snuffing considerably in the direction of the various bottles, ordered at last a mint julep in a thin and quivering voice, and with an air of great circumspection. When poured out, he took it and looked at it with a sharp, complacent air, like a man who thinks he has done about the right thing, and hit the nail on the head and proceeded to dispose of it in short and well-advised sips.
"Well, now, who'd have thought this yar luck had come to me? Why, Locker, how are you?"
said Haley, coming forward and extending his hand to the big man.
"The devil," was the civil reply. "What brought you here, Haley?"
The mousing man, who bore the name of Marks, instantly stopped his sipping, and, poking his head forward, looked shrewdly on the new acquaintance, as a cat sometimes looks at a moving dry leaf, or some other possible object of pursuit.
"I say, Tom, this air's the luckiest thing in the world. I'm in a devil of a hobble, and you must help me out." Like enough," grunted his complacent acquaintance. "A body may be pretty sure of that when you're glad to see 'em. Something to be made off of 'em. What's the blow now?" "You've got a friend here?" said Haley, looking doubtfully at Marks. "Partner, perhaps?"
"Yes, I have. Here, Marks, here's that our fellow that I was in with Natchez."
"Shall be pleased with his acquaintance,"
said Marks, thrusting out a long, thin hand like a raven's claw.
"Mr. Haley, I believe?"
"The same, sir," said Haley. "And now, gentlemen, seeing as we've met so happily, I think I'll stand up to a small matter of a treat in this here parlor. So now, old coon," said he to the man at the bar, "get us hot water, and sugar, and cigars, and plenty of the real stuff, and we'll have a blowout."
Behold, then, the candles lighted, the fire stimulated to the burning point in the grate, and our three worthies seated round a table, well spread with all the accessories to good fellowship enumerated before. Haley began a pathetic recital of his peculiar troubles. Locker shut up his mouth and listened to him with gruff and surly attention. Marks, who was anxiously, and with much fidgeting, compounding a tumbler of punch to his own peculiar taste, occasionally looked up from his employment, and, poking his sharp nose and chin almost into Haley's face, gave the most earnest heed to the whole narrative. The conclusion of it appeared to amuse him extremely, for he shook his shoulders and sides in silence, and perked up his thin lips with an air of great internal enjoyment.
"So then, you're fairly sewed up, ain't you?" he said. "It's neatly done, too."
"This yare young'un business makes lots of troubles in the trade," said Haley dolefully.
"If we could get a breed of gals that didn't care now for their young'uns," said Marks, "I tell you, I think it would be about the greatest modern improvement I knows on."
And Marks patronized his joke by a quiet introductory sniggle.
"Just so," said Haley. "I never couldn't see into it. The young'uns is heaps of trouble to 'em. One would think, now, they'd be glad to get clear on 'em, but they aren't. And the more trouble a young'un is, and the more good-for-nothing as gentle thing, the tighter they sticks to 'em."
"Well, Mr. Haley," said Marks, "let's pass the hot water. Yes, sir, you say as what I feel that I'll have. Now, I bought a gal once, when I was in the trade. A tight, likely wench she was, too, and quite considerable smart. And she had a young'un that was miserable sickly. It had a crooked back, or something or other, and I just gin away to a man that thought he'd take his chance raising on't, being it didn't cost nothing. Never thought, of the gal's taking on about it, but lor, you ought to see how she went on. Why, raly, she did seem to me to vally the child more 'cause 'twas sickly and cross and plagued her, and she warn't making believe, neither. Cried about it, she did, and loped around, as if she'd lost every friend she had. It really was droll to think on't. Lord, there ain't no end to women's notions."
"Well, just so with me," said Haley. "Last summer, down on Red River, I got a gal traded off on me, with a likely-looking child enough, and his eyes looked as bright as yourn, but come to look, I found him stone blind. Fact, he was stone blind. Well, you see, I thought there warn't no harm in my just passing him along, and not saying nothing, and I'd got him nicely swapped off for a keg of whiskey, but come to get him away from the gal, she was just like a tiger. So 'twas before we started, and I hadn't got my gang chained up, so what should she do but ups on a cotton bale like a cat, catches a knife from one of the deck hands, and I tell you, she made all fly for a minute, till she saw 'twas no use, and she just turns round and pitches head first, young'un and all, into the river. Went down plump, never rise."
"Bah!" said Tom Locker, who had listened to these stories with ill-repressed disgust.
"Shiftless, both on you. My gals don't cut on no such shines, I tell you."
"Indeed, how do you help it?" said Marks briskly.
"Help it? Why, I buys a gal, and if she's got a young'un to be sold, I just walks up and puts my fist to her face and says, 'Look here, now, if you give me one word out of your head, I'll smash your face in. I won't hear one word, not the beginning of a word,' I says to him. 'This here young'un's mine, and not yourn, and you've no kind of business with it. I'm going to sell it first chance. Mind you don't cut up none of your shines about it, or I'll make you wish you'd never been born. I tell you, they sees it ain't no play when I gets hold. I makes 'em as white as fishes, and if one on 'em begins and gives a yelp, why—" And Mr. Locker brought down his fist with a thump that fully explained the hiatus. "That ar's what you may call emphasis," said Marks, poking Haley in the side, and going into another small giggle. "Ain't Tom peculiar? I say, Tom, I expect you make 'em understand, for all niggers' heads is woolly. They don't never have no doubt o' your meaning, Tom. If you ain't the devil, Tom, you's his twin brother, I'll say that for you." Tom received the compliment with becoming modesty, and began to look as affable as was consistent, as John Bunyan says, with his doggish nature. Haley, who had been imbibing very freely of the staple of the evening, began to feel a sensible elevation and enlargement of his moral faculties, a phenomenon not unusual with gentlemen of the serious and reflective turn under similar circumstances. "Well, now, Tom," he said, "you really is too bad, as I always have told you. You know, Tom, you and I used to talk over these yar matters down Natchez, and I used to prove to you that we made full as much and was as well off for this yar world by treating on 'em well, besides keeping a better chance for coming in the kingdom at last, when worst comes to worst, and there ain't nothing else left to get, you know." "Bah!" said Tom. "Don't I know? Don't make me too sick with any yar stuff. My stomach is a leetle riled now," and Tom drank half a glass of raw brandy. "I say," said Haley, and leaning back in his chair and gesturing impressively, "I'll say this now. I always meant to drive my trade so as to make money on't fust and foremost, as much as any man. But then, trade ain't everything, and money ain't everything, 'cause we's all got souls. I don't care, now, who hears me say it, and I think a cussed sight on it, so I may as well come out with it. I believe in religion, and one of these days, when I got matters tight and snug, I calculates to tend to my soul in them ar matters. And so, what's the use of doing any more wickedness than's really necessary? Don't seem to me it's at all prudent." "Tend to your soul," repeated Tom contemptuously. "Take a bright lookout to find a soul in you. Save yourself any care on that score. If the devil sifts you through a hair sieve, he won't find one." "Why, Tom, you're cross," said Haley. "Why can't you take it pleasant, now, when a feller's talking for your good?" "Stop that ar jaw yourn there," said Tom gruffly. "I can stand most any talk of yourn but your pious talk. That kills me right up. After all, what's the odds between me and you? T'ant that you care one bit more or have a bit more feeling, it's clean sheer dog meanness, wanting to cheat the devil and save your own skin. Don't I see through it? And your getting religion, as you call it, after all, is too pison mean for any critter. Run up a bill with the devil all your life, and then sneak out when pay time comes. Bob!" Come, gentlemen, I say, this isn't business," said Marks. "There's different ways, you know, of looking at all subjects. Mr. Haley is a very nice man, no doubt, and has his own conscience. And, Tom, you have your ways, and very good ones, too, Tom. But quarreling, you know, won't answer no kind of purpose. Let's go to business. Now, Mr. Haley, what is it? You want us to undertake to catch this yar gal?" "The gal's no matter mine. She's Shelby's. It's only the boy. And I was a fool for buying the monkey." "You're generally a fool," said Tom gruffly. "Come now, Locker, none of your huffs," said Marks, licking his lips. "You see, Mr. Haley's putting us in a way of a good job, I reckon. Just hold still. These yer arrangements is my forte. This yer gal, Mr. Haley, how is she? What is she?" "Well, white and handsome, well brought up. I gin Shelby 800 or 1,000, and then made well on her."
"White and handsome, well brought up," said Marks, his sharp eyes, nose, and mouth all alive with enterprise. "Look here now, Locker, a beautiful opening. We'll do a business here on our own account. We does the catching. The boy, of course, goes to Mr. Haley. We takes the gal to Orleans to speculate on. Ain't it beautiful?" Tom, whose great heavy mouth had stood ajar during this communication, now suddenly snapped it together as a big dog closes on a piece of meat, and seemed to be digesting the idea at his leisure. "You see," said Marks to Haley, stirring his punch as he did so, "you see, we has justices convenient at all p'ints along shore, that does up any little jobs in our line quite reasonable.
Tom, he does the knocking down and that and I come in all dressed up, shining boots, everything first chop when the swearing's to be done. You ought to see now," said Marks, in a glow of professional pride, "how I can tone it off. One day I'm Mr. Twickham from New Orleans, another day I'm just come from my plantation on Pearl River, where I work 700 niggers. Then again I come out a distant relation of Henry Clay, or some old cock in Kentuck. Talents is different, you know. Now, Tom's roarer when there's any thumping or fighting to be done, but at lying he ain't good, Tom ain't. You see, it don't come natural to him. But, Lord, if thar's a feller in the country that can swear to anything and everything, and put in all the circumstances and flourishes with a long face, and carry through better'n I can, why, I'd like to see him, that's all. I believe in my heart I could get along and snake through even if justices were more particular than they is. Sometimes I rather wish they was more particular. 'Twould be a heap more relishin' if they was. More fun, you know." Tom Locker, who, as we have made it appear, was a man of slow thoughts and movements, here interrupted Marks by bringing his heavy fist down on the table so as to make it all ring again.
"It'll do," he said.
"Lord bless you, Tom, you needn't break all the glasses," said Marks. "Save your fist for the time of need."
"But, gentlemen, ain't I to come in for a share of the profits?" said Haley.
"Ain't it enough we catch the boy for you?" said Locker.
"What do you want?" "Well," said Haley, "if I gives you the job it's worth something, say 10% on the profits, expenses paid."
"Now," said Locker, with a tremendous oath, and striking the table with his heavy fist, "don't I know you, Dan Haley? Don't you think to come it over me. Suppose Marks and I have taken up the catching trade, just to accommodate gentlemen like you, and get nothing for ourselves. Not by a long chalk. We'll have the gal out and out, and you keep quiet, or you see we'll have both. What's to hinder? Hadn't you showed us the game? It's as free to us as you, I hope. If you or Shelby wants to catch us, look where the partridges was last year. If you find them or us, you're quite welcome."
"Oh, well, certainly, just let it go at that," said Haley, alarmed. "You catch the boy for the job. You allers did trade fire with me, Tom, and was up to your word."
"You know that," said Tom. "I don't pretend none of your sniveling ways, but I won't lie in my accounts with the devil himself. What I says I'll do, I will do. You know that, Dan Haley."
Just so. I said so, Tom," said Haley. "And if you'd only promise to have the boy for me in a week, at any point you'll name, that's all I want."
"But it ain't all I want, by a long jump," said Tom. "You don't think I did business with you down Natchez for nothing, Haley. I've learned to hold an eel when I catch him. You've got to fork over $50 flat down, or this child don't start a peg. I know you're."
"Why, when you have a job in hand that may bring a clean profit of somewhere about 1,000 or 1,600, why, Tom, you're unreasonable," said Haley.
"Yes, and hasn't we business booked for 5 weeks to come, all we can do? And suppose we leaves all and goes to bushwhacking round out of your young'uns and finally doesn't catch the gal, and gals allers is the devil to catch. What's then? Would you pay us a cent, would you? I think I see you doing it, Hug." No, flap down your 50. If we get the job and it pays, I'll hand it back. If we don't, it's for our trouble. That's fair, ain't it, Marks?" Certainly, said Marks, with a conciliatory tone. "It's only a retaining fee, you see. We lawyers, you know. Well, we must all keep good-natured. Keep easy, you know. Tom'll have the boy for you, anywhere you'll name. Won't you, Tom? If I find the young'un, I'll bring him on to Cincinnati and leave him at Granny Belcher's on the landing," said Locker. Marks had got from his pocket a greasy pocketbook, and taking a long paper from thence, he sat down, and fixing his keen black eyes on it, began mumbling over its contents. "Barnes, Shelby County, boy, Jim, $300 for him, dead or alive. Edwards, Dick and Lucy, man and wife, $600. Wench Polly and 2 children, $600 for her or her head. I'm just running over our business to see if we can take up this yar handily. Locker," he said, after a pause, "we must set Adams and Springer on the track of these yar. They've been booked some time."
"They'll charge too much," said Tom.
"I'll manage that ar. They's young in the business, and must 'spect to work cheap," said Marks, as he continued to read. "There's 3 on 'em easy cases, 'cause all you got to do is to shoot 'em or swear they shot. They couldn't, of course, charge much for that. Them other cases," he said, folding the paper, "will bear putting off a spell. So now let's come to the particulars. Now, Mr. Haley, you saw this ar gal when she landed?"
"To be sure, plain as I see you."
"And a man helping on her up the bank," said Locker.
"To be sure I did."
"Most likely," said Marks, "she's took in somewhere. But where's a question. Tom, what do you say?" "We must cross the river tonight, no mistake," said Tom. "But there's no boat about," said Marks. "The ice is running awfully, Tom. Ain't it dangerous?" "Don't know nothing about that, only it's got to be done," said Tom decidedly. "Dear me," said Marks, fidgeting. "It'll be I say," he said, walking to the window, "it's dark as a wolf's mouth, and Tom—"
"The long and short is you're scared, Marks."
"But I can't help that. You've got to go. Suppose you want to lie by a day or two till the gal's been carried on the underground line up to Sandusky or so, before you start." "Oh, no, I ain't a grain afraid," said Marks. "Only—"
"Only what?"
said Tom. "Well, about the boat. You see, there ain't any boat. I heard the woman say there was one coming along this evening, and that a man was going to cross over in it. Neck or nothing, we must go with him," said Tom.
"I suppose you got good dogs?"
said Haley. "First rate," said Marks. "But what's the use? You hain't got nothing of hers to smell on."
"Yes, I have," said Haley triumphantly. "Here's her shawl she left on the bed in a hurry. She left her bonnet, too."
"That ar's lucky," said Locker. "Fork over."
"Though the dogs might damage the gal if they come on her unwires," said Haley.
"That ar's a consideration," said Marks. "Our dogs tore a feller half to pieces once down in Mobile before we could get 'em off."
"Well, you see, for this sort that's to be sold for their looks, that I won't answer, you see," said Haley.
"I do see," said Marks. "Besides, if she's got took in, 'tain't no go neither. Dogs is no account in these up states where these critters get carried. Of course you can't get on their track. They only does down in plantations where niggers, when they runs, has to do their own running and don't get no help." "Well," said Locker, who had just stepped out to the bar to make some inquiries, "they say the man's come with the boat. So, Marks?" That worthy cast a rueful look at the comfortable quarters he was leaving, but slowly rose to obey. After exchanging a few words of further arrangement, Haley, with visible reluctance, handed over the $50 to Tom, and the worthy trio separated for the night. If any of our refined and Christian readers object to the society into which this scene introduces them, let us beg them to begin and conquer their prejudices in time. The catching business, we beg to remind them, is rising to the dignity of a lawful and patriotic profession. If all the broad land between Mississippi and the Pacific becomes one great market for bodies and souls, and human property retains the locomotive tendencies of this 19th century, the trader and catcher may yet be among our aristocracy. While this scene was going on at the tavern, Sam and Andy, in a state of high felicitation, pursued their way home. Sam was in the highest possible feather, and expressed his exultation by all sorts of supernatural howls and ejaculations, by divers odd motions and contortions of his whole system. Sometimes he would sit backward, with his face to the horse's tail and sides, and then, with a whoop and a somerset, come right side up in his place again, and, drawing on a grave face, begin to lecture Andy in high-sounding tones for laughing and playing the fool. Anon, slapping his sides with his arms, he would burst forth in peals of laughter that made the old woods ring as they passed. With all these evolutions, he contrived to keep the horses up to the top of their speed until, between 10 and 11, their heels resounded on the gravel at the end of the balcony. Mrs. Shelby flew to the railings. "Is that you, Sam? Where are they?"
"Master Haley's a resting at the tavern. He's dreffle fatigued, missus."
"And Eliza, Sam?"
"Why, she's clear across Jordan, as a body may say, in the land of Canaan."
"Why, Sam, what do you mean?" said Mrs. Shelby, breathless and almost faint, as the possible meaning of these words came over her.
"Well, missus, the Lord, He preserves His own. Lizzie's done gone over the river into Ohio, as markably as if the Lord took her over in a chariot of fire and 2 hosses."
Sam's vein of piety was always uncommonly fervent in his mistress's presence, and he made great capital of scriptural figures and images. "Come up here, Sam," said Mr. Shelby, who had followed on to the veranda, "and tell your mistress what she wants. Come, Emily," said he, passing his arm round her. You were cold and all in a shiver. You allow yourself to feel too much."
"Feel too much? Am I not a woman? A mother? Are we not both responsible to God for this poor girl? My God, lay not this sin to our charge."
"What sin, Emily? You see yourself that we have only done what we were obliged to."
"There's an awful feeling of guilt about it, though," said Mrs. Shelby. "I can't reason it away."
"Here, Andy, you nigger, be alive," called Sam under the veranda. "Take these yar horses to der barn. Don't you hear Massa calling?" And Sam soon appeared, palm leaf in hand, at the parlor door.
"Now, Sam, tell us distinctly how the matter was," said Mr. Shelby. "Where is Eliza, if you know?"
"Well, Massa, I saw her with my own eyes, a crossin' on the floating ice. She crossed most remarkably. It wasn't no less nor a miracle, and I saw a man help her up on the howe side, and then she was lost in the dusk."
"Sam, I think this rather apocryphal, this miracle. Crossing on floating ice isn't so easily done," said Mr. Shelby.
"Easy? Couldn't nobody done it without the Lord. Why, now," said Sam, "'twas just this yer way. Massa Haley and me and Andy, we comes up to the little tavern by the river, and I rides a leetle ahead. I was so zealous to be cotchin' Lizzie that I couldn't hold in no way. And when I comes by the tavern winder, sure enough there she was, right in plain sight, and dey diggin' on behind, while I loses off my head and I sings out enough to raise the dead. Course Lizzie she hires, and she dodges back, when Mass Haley he gone past the door, and then, I tell you, she clared out the side door. She went down to the river bank. Mass Haley he seed her and yelled out, and him and me and Andy we took arter. Down she come to the river, and thar was the current running 10 feet wide by the shore, and over t'other side a ice a sawin' and a jiggling up and down, kinder as 'twere a great island. We come right behind her, and I thought my soul he'd got her sure enough, when she gin sich a screech as I never hearn, and there she was clar on to the other side of the current, on the ice, and then on she went, a screeching and a jumping. The ice went crack, swallop, crack and chunk, and she a bounding like a buck. Lord, the spring that our gal's got in there ain't common, I'm opinion."
Mrs. Shelby sat perfectly still, pale with excitement, while Sam told his story. "God be praised, she isn't dead," she said. "But where is the poor child now?"
"The Lord will provide," said Sam, rolling up his eyes piously. "As I've been a-sayin', this yer is a providence and no mistake, as Missus has allers been instructin' on us. There's allers instruments rise up to the Lord's will. Now, if 'tadn't been for me today, she'd have been took a dozen times. Warn't it I started off the hosses this yer mornin' and kept 'em chasing till nigh dinner time? And didn't I car Massa Haley night 5 miles out the road this evening, or else he'd a come up a Lizzie as easy as a dog arter coon. These yer's all providences."
"They are a kind of providences that you'll have to be pretty sparing of, Master Sam. I allow no such practices with gentlemen on my place," said Mr. Shelby, with as much sternness as he could command under the circumstances. "Now, there is no more use in making believe be angry with a negro than with a child. Both instinctively see the true state of the case, through all attempts to effect the contrary. And Sam was in no wise disheartened by this rebuke, though he assumed an air of doleful gravity, and stood with the corners of his mouth lowered in most penitential style.
"Massa's quite right, quite. It was ugly on me. There's no disputing that are. And of course Massa and Missus wouldn't encourage no such works. I'm sensible of that are. But a poor nigger like me's mazin' tempted to act ugly sometimes, when fellers will cut up such shines as that are Massa Haley. He ain't no gentleman no way. Anybody that's been raised as I've been can't help seeing that are."
"Well, Sam," said Mrs. Shelby, "as you appear to have a proper sense of your errors, you may go now, and tell Aunt Chloe she may get you some of that cold ham that was left of dinner today. You and Andy must be hungry."
"Missus is a heap too good for us," said Sam, making his bow with alacrity and departing.
It will be perceived, as has been before intimated, that Master Sam had a native talent that might undoubtedly have raised him to eminence in political life, a talent of making capital out of everything that turned up, to be invested for his own especial praise and glory. And having done up his piety and humility, as he trusted, to the satisfaction of the parlor, he clapped his palm leaf on his head
with a sort of rakish, free and easy air, and proceeded to the dominions of Aunt Chloe, with the intention of flourishing largely in the kitchen.
"I'll speechify these yar niggers," said Sam to himself, "now I've got a chance. Lord, I'll reel it off to make 'em stare."
It must be observed that one of Sam's especial delights had been to ride in attendance on his master to all kinds of political gatherings, where, roosted on some rail fence, or perched aloft in some tree, he would sit watching the orators with the greatest apparent gusto, and then, descending among the various brethren of his own color, assembled on the same errand, he would edify and delight them with the most ludicrous burlesques and imitations, all delivered with the most imperturbable earnestness and solemnity. And though the auditors immediately about him were generally of his own color, it not infrequently happened that they were fringed pretty deeply with those of a fair complexion, who listened, laughing and winking, to Sam's great self-congratulation. In fact, Sam considered oratory as his vocation, and never let slip an opportunity of magnifying his office. Now, between Sam and Aunt Chloe there had existed, from ancient times, a sort of chronic feud, or rather a decided coolness. But, as Sam was meditating something in the provision department, as the necessary and obvious foundation of his operations, he determined, on the present occasion, to be eminently conciliatory, for he well knew that although Mrs. Orders would undoubtedly be followed to the letter, yet he should gain a considerable deal by enlisting the spirit also. He therefore appeared before Aunt Chloe with a touchingly subdued, resigned expression, like one who has suffered immeasurable hardships in behalf of a persecuted fellow creature. Enlarged upon the fact that Mrs. had directed him to come to Aunt Chloe for whatever might be wanting to make up the balance in his solids and fluids, and thus unequivocally acknowledged her right and supremacy in the cooking department, and all thereto pertaining. The thing took accordingly. No poor, simple, virtuous body was ever cajoled by the attentions of an electioneering politician with more ease than Aunt Chloe was won over by Master Sam's suavities, and if he had been the prodigal son himself, he could not have been overwhelmed with more maternal bountifulness, and he soon found himself seated, happy and glorious, over a large tin pan containing a sort of olla podrida of all that had appeared on the table for 2 or 3 days past. Savory morsels of ham, golden blocks of corn cake, fragments of pie of every conceivable mathematical figure, chicken wings, gizzards, and drumsticks, all appeared in picturesque confusion, and Sam, as monarch of all he surveyed, sat with his palm leaf cocked rejoicingly to one side, and patronizing Andy at his right hand. The kitchen was full of all his compeers, who had hurried and crowded in from the various cabins to hear the termination of the day's exploits. Now was Sam's hour of glory. The story of the day was rehearsed, with all kinds of ornament and varnishing which might be necessary to heighten its effect. For Sam, like some of our fashionable dilettanti, never allowed a story to lose any of its gilding by passing through his hands. Roars of laughter attended the narration, and were taken up and prolonged by all the smaller fry, who were lying in any quantity about on the floor, or perched in every corner. In the height of the uproar and laughter, Sam, however, preserved an immovable gravity, only from time to time rolling his eyes up and giving his auditors divers inexpressibly droll glances, without departing from the sententious elevation of his oratory. "You see, fellow countrymen," said Sam, elevating a turkey's leg with energy, "you see now what this 'ere child up ter, for fending yer all, yes, all on yer. For him as tries to get one of our people is as good as trying to get all. You see the principle is the same. That ar's clar. And any one of these 'ere drivers that comes smelling round arter any of our people, why, he's got me in his way. I'm the feller he's got to set in with. I'm the feller for you all to come to, bredden. I'll stand up for your rights. I'll fend 'em to the last breath." "Why, but Sam, you telled me only this morning that you'd help this 'ere massa to cotch Lizzie. Seems to me your talk don't hang together," said Andy. "I tell you now, Andy," said Sam with awful superiority, "don't yer be talking about what yer don't know nothing on. Boys like you, Andy, means well, but they can't be 'spected to hallucinate the great principles of action." Andy looked rebuked, particularly by the hard word hallucinate, which most of the youngerly members of the company seemed to consider as a settler in the case, while Sam proceeded.
dat ar was conscience, Andy. When I thought of gwine arter Lizzie, I raly expected Masser was sot that way. When I found Missis was sot the contrar, dat ar was conscience more yet. 'Cause fellers allers gets more by stickin' to Missis' side. So you see I's persistent either way, and sticks up to conscience, and holds on to principles. Yes, principles, said Sam, giving an enthusiastic toss of a chicken's neck. What's principles good for if we isn't persistent, I want to know. Thar, Andy, you may have dat ar bone. 'Tain't picked up clean. Sam's audience hanging on his words with open mouth, he could not but proceed. This here matter about persistence, fellow niggers, said Sam, with the air of one entering into an abstruse subject. This here sistency thing what ain't seed into very clear by most people. Now, you see, when a feller stands up for a thing one day and night, the contrary the next, folks says, and natural enough they says, why, he ain't persistent. Hand me dat ar bit of corn cake, Andy. But let's look inter it. I hope the gentlemen and their fair sex will excuse my using an ordinary sort of parison. Here, I'm a trying to get a topper to hay. Well, I puts up my larder this yar side. 'Tain't no go. Then, 'cause I don't try der no more, but puts my larder right the contrary side. Ain't I persistent? I'm persistent and want to get up which ar side my larder is. Don't you see, all on yer? It's the only thing you ever was persistent in, Lord knows, muttered Aunt Chloe, who was getting rather restive, the merriment of the evening being to her somewhat after the Scripture comparison, like vinegar upon nitre. Yes, indeed, said Sam, rising, full of supper and glory, for a closing effort. Yes, my feller citizens and ladies of the other sex in general, I has principles. I'm proud to own them. They's persequit to these to your times, and ter all times. I has principles, and I sticks to 'em like 40. Just anything that I thinks is principles, I goes ter it. I wouldn't mind if they burnt me live. I'd walk right up to the stake, I would, and say, here I comes to shed my last blood for my principles, for my country, for the general interest of society. Well, said Aunt Chloe, one of your principles will have to be to get to bed some time tonight, and not to be keeping everybody up till morning. Now, every one of you young'uns that don't want to be cracked, it better be scarce mighty sudden. Niggers, all of yer, said Sam, waving his palm leaf with benignity, I give yer my blessing. Go to bed now, and be good boys. And with this pathetic benediction, the assembly dispersed. End of chapter 8.